Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video what we're going to be talking about is the historical evidence for things Jesus said. What did Jesus really say? What would Jesus say? Or what did Jesus actually, Jesus Christ of Nazareth's teachings. Specifically, he taught a lot of things, and we're not going to look at every single thing that Jesus taught, or even every single thing that we can prove historically that he taught. Rather, just some specific teachings that Jesus gave us about who he is. Because the central tenet of Jesus' teaching is actually Jesus. He's sort of the messenger and the message. Now, the reason why we're talking about Jesus' teaching is because it functions as a premise and an overall argument for the truth of Christianity. So we can think of this as an argument for the truth of Christianity. Premise 1, God raised Jesus from the dead. Premise 2, Jesus claimed radical things about himself that would be blasphemy against God if they weren't true. And so conclusion, therefore God confirmed the truth of Jesus' teaching by raising him from the dead. So in other words, the things Jesus taught, if we can really prove that he taught these things, then and we can prove also that God raised him from the dead, which that's a whole other point that we're making with these historical evidence videos. Those two premises combine in a syllogism or in an argument that says hey, this and this together proves Christianity true. You can think of it this way: given what Jesus said, really radical, extreme things about himself, that if they were not true, and God raised him from the dead, then it's God's fault for us being Christians. God's trying to trick us. We know from our philosophical work on God's nature that God wouldn't trick us, so yada yada. Now you might be saying well, Ben, how do you really know God raised Jesus from the dead? Well, that's a whole other point that we're addressing at length. So that's a whole other point. But for the sake of this video, we're not looking at that point. We're just looking at what did Jesus really teach. Now, there's a few issues for us to think about when it comes to Jesus' teaching. It's a little different from the resurrection. The resurrection is an event that occurred in Jesus' life, whereas the teachings are things Jesus said, which are also events, but they're a little different. It's not something that happened to Jesus. It's more like just things Jesus said. So when it comes to the resurrection, historians have come to a consensus that it is not a later legend that was made up over and added to and embellished. That at least at the core, the basic idea of the resurrection goes all the way back to the earliest followers of Jesus. That is agreed upon by the consensus of historians today. That may strike people as shocking, but that's a topic for a whole other video. It can be confusing, though, because when it comes to Jesus' teaching, the issue of legends is very much a live issue. This is not a dead issue at all. Was Jesus' teaching embellished and added to a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and over a long enough period of time, you get this grand story, and that's what a legend is, where it slowly gets added to and made more incredible, So, when it comes to Jesus' teaching, what we're going to be looking at are specifically, as William Lane Craig puts it, Jesus' radical self-claims. Basically, extreme, outrageous, crazy things he said about himself that would be horribly blasphemy against God. In other words, if they're not true, then this is basically a way of saying horrible things about God, because he's claiming things about his connection to God that if they're not true, they are very disrespectful towards God, and they are, God really should strike him dead. He certainly shouldn't raise him from the dead. Okay, so there is a huge point of confusion on this that we're going to need to address, but before we address that, you can look at Jesus' teaching as a form of historical evidence for Christianity that functions all on its own without looking at the evidence for the resurrection. And this comes from the famous Christian apologist and writer C.S. Lewis. And his point, C.S. Lewis's point, was just that was what's called the liar, lunatic, Lord trilemma. Given Jesus's radical self-claims, you cannot say that he was merely just some Jewish rabbi who taught some nice things about love your neighbor and give to the poor. Like, no. If these things aren't true that he said about himself, then he is either a lunatic, he's crazy, or he's a liar, or as Lewis put it, he is the devil or a demon. Or you have to accept him as Lord. So, that can function independently, because you can look at the teachings of Jesus and you can say, like, this doesn't seem like a bad guy. He seems like a good person, but he also made these radical self-claims. Okay? But on the other hand, you can say, well, maybe he's a nut job. Well, there's a certain consistency and organization that doesn't sound like a crazy person. He seems like he's well thought out and well put together in the overall course of things he's saying. So you can look at Jesus' teaching and independently come to an argument in favor of Christianity based on C.S. Lewis's trilemma. We're not going that route. We're going with God raised him from the dead, and he made these radical claims about himself, and these radical claims are affirmed by God by raising him from the dead. And the reason why we're going that route is because that's the route that the Bible takes. The Bible makes it clear that it's the resurrection that God used to affirm the truth of Jesus' teaching. That is the format that is the biblical format. That's what convinced the apostles. That's what, that's how that worked biblically. And if he's not raised from the dead, then we might as well stop being Christians. We would still believe in God and a good God, etc., etc. But Christianity's not true. But if he did raise him from the dead, then Jesus Christ is the Messiah. That is how it worked for the apostles, and so that's how it works for us. Okay, that is the biblical model. So if you want to be biblical in your approach, there you go. Now, the issue to think about, that there is a big hang up, a big confusion that we need to address with this, and it comes to this whole question of did Jesus really claim to be God? And in terms of what we can prove historically that Jesus said, we're going to be taking a very minimalistic approach. We're not going to sit back and say, okay, we've got to prove that everything Jesus is quoted as saying in Mark, and everything that Jesus supposedly is, that Luke claims he says, and that John claims he says, and that Paul claims he says, and that Matthew claims he says, that he really did say all those things. No. That would take forever. What we're going to do is just look at a short, simple list of things that he said. Okay? And we can prove historically that he did in fact say those things. That it is more like that, you are irrational to reject it because it's so likely that he said them that you really should believe it. Okay? So, given that he said those things, we can make a case that, these things would either be blasphemous or true. Okay, so the question is, did Jesus claim to be God? Well, what we're going to discover in these claims is these things that we can prove Jesus said are, you could take them that way, but they're a little bit vague, they're a little bit ambiguous. He's clearly claiming something incredible about himself, but claiming to be the second person of the Trinity is really incredible. Okay, so this becomes a hang-up for Christians when studying this historical evidence, because we as Christians get distracted by this question of where did the doctrine of the Trinity and the incarnation of Jesus Christ as the second person of the Trinity and the Holy Spirit and God the Father, how did that even come into the picture? It seems like Christians made that up later. And so we need to address that. If we're looking at Jesus' teaching about himself, we need to address this question of like, where did the doctrine of the Trinity and the incarnation of Jesus, where did that come from? Christology. There's all these debates among Christians, and so we need to make a point about that. So before we get into the historical evidence for Jesus' radical self-claims, we're going to just look at this first part, which is not, I'm not going to give you historical evidence that this is how it played out. It's just that this is plausible and there's no problem with it. And if you're a Bible-believing Christian, you have a pathway to the doctrines of the Trinity that were affirmed. I mean, really, I think Chalcedon is like the Council of Chalcedon. Let's see, that's when it really gets nailed down. And that comes, I think, at like 500 AD. Council of Chalcedon. Let's see. So 451. Okay, I think that's it. All right, so the Council of Chalcedon, Christian churches come together and finally affirm this. You got the Council of Nicaea right when in 323 when Constantine becomes emperor. So anyway, that gives you an idea. How do we get from A to B? First, before I talk about historical evidence for what Jesus said, we need this like timeline, a plausible timeline. And this first part is just for Bible-believing Christians. So that there's nothing, crazy, and there's no point in which, like, Christians are just making up doctrines willy-nilly, okay? So, the first point we need to make is that logical deductions take time. And so, deduction means to divide. And, so for example, if I was to give you, a triangle has 3 sides and 3 straight sides, you could deduce from that, like, the angles between the sides, the interior angles between the sides, must add up to 180 degrees. It would take time for you to calculate that and figure that out and prove that mathematically. And it would take more time for you to prove that if you take the long side and you square it, and then you take the 2 short sides, square them, and add them together, that will be equal. That's the Pythagorean theorem. So all of that is entailed by just the definition of what a triangle is. It's a polygon. It's straight-sided. All the sides connect. There's 3 sides. 3 angles, triangle. Like, you could, it's already there in the shape of a triangle. It's already stated, but it's just like the deduction takes time. So, like, Jesus could say things about himself that are extreme and grand, and then you would have to think on them and unpack all that they might mean. Divide out all of the meanings that are necessarily entailed by those statements. Okay, so anyway, so we start with Jesus's explicit claims about himself. And the ones where they're actually a lot more than what we're going to look at in this video. But I'll just give you a list that's just like the ones that are in this video. He said that he is something beyond all humans and beyond even all the angels. That's not really a direct claim to be God, but it's still blasphemous for him to say that if it's not true, because he's putting himself right, it's like vice president to God kind of thing, okay? He also claims that he is the only one who truly knows God. Okay, so that's really up there, okay? And then we've got, the event where, he's killed and God raises him from the dead. We've got other stuff that we're going to see that he claimed, but, he's got these extreme claims about himself that, he's putting himself way up there, okay? And the issue is, the doctrine of the Trinity is very complicated, it's very easy to misunderstand. In fact, it's very common for us today to misunderstand it still to this day, because it's very tricky, because essentially you run into this issue where okay, Jesus is God, the Father is God, and there's only one God. How does that work? It's very complicated, and there's a lot of argument and debate about how exactly that works. There's all kinds of different ideas, but so what Jesus does, instead of something, it took us centuries of debate to like try to reason out how all of that works. Jesus just makes these extreme claims about himself. And there's more than one way to take them. Okay. So like, it is, we'll see that he goes on to we'll see how it's not that Christians just made up the idea that Jesus is God. We'll see where that comes from in just a minute. But like, my point is this, that these radical claims he made about himself, Jesus kind of unpacked it slowly. The format that Mark lays out for us is one where Jesus slowly adds to it, and slowly people are like, wait a minute, what is this guy saying? Who is he claiming to be? And it gets more and more extreme, and he draws more and more opposition till eventually he gets to the trial, and they're like, are you claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God? And then he's like, boom, he hits them with this like extreme claim, and then they're like freaking out, and they want to kill him on the spot. Okay, so it's like he builds up to this crescendo, this dramatic moment where he just like whammos everybody with this claim. He gets executed for this radical claim about himself, and then God raises him from the dead. And then it's like all the apostles are like, this is the most incredible thing that ever happened, like, wow, So like, the thing to understand here is that Jesus is like building up, slowly revealing more and more, slowly working on people, getting them to understand it. And sometimes he tells people stuff that like they don't get until after it all happens, and they're like, oh, now I get it, because they're so locked into like another way of seeing things. So like, their idea of a Messiah before Jesus came was one like a God was going to. It's not even blasphemous to claim to be the Messiah. That's not blasphemous in the Jewish view today or back then. But like what Jesus would be saying is like, hey, that when they see a Messiah, they thought that that's a guy that like he's going to be a mighty Jewish king, and he's going to militarily lead the Jews to independence, and then he's going to conquer the whole world militarily, and the whole world is going to be under his one political government, and then he's going to do away with all of the evil morals and make God's law, the law of Moses, to be the law for the whole world, and then everybody is going to stop being so evil and sinful, and they're all going to follow God's law. So like, the Romans thought slavery was okay, whereas the law of Moses says it was a sin. The Romans didn't mind conquering people and killing them and taking all their stuff and bragging about it, and around the world, like, everyone saw that as okay. They had no idea that like you should care about people and help people, and these concepts of like, there was just none of that. They worshiped these other gods who were petty and cruel and jealous and slept around, and they didn't worship the good God. So they thought there was going to be this Messiah that like was going to change all of that. But Jesus, the Gospels record Jesus as saying like the Messiah has to suffer and die, and after 3 days he'll be raised from the dead. And they don't get it. The apostles, these people who tell us that also tell us that they didn't get it, and that they just didn't. When he was killed, they thought, well, the Messiah is supposed to be this military leader that can't be executed by the Romans. He's supposed to militarily defeat the Romans. So they think it's over. The whole Jesus thing is over. And then God raises him from the dead. And then they have to hit like a massive reset on like everything they believed. And what happens is, what the Bible tells us is that Jesus is back from the dead and spends some time with his followers, and it says that, like in Luke, it says he opened their mind to understand the scriptures and understand like who he is. And so a lot of these doctrines that we come to accept about Jesus, and you say, Jesus didn't seem to clearly teach this, like did Jesus clearly teach that he was supposed to die for our sins and be the sacrifice for our sins? It's not so clear that he taught that before he died. It seems to be something that he talked clearly to the apostles after he came back from the dead, and they're like, oh, now we get it. So the resurrected Christ spent time with his followers after he resurrected and taught them. And in Paul's case, he says Jesus appeared to him in the sky. And Paul claims that he went to the Arabian desert and was taught by Jesus there about all this. So, like, that's how he knows the basic idea of Jesus. In addition to that, after all of, the Bible tells us that, like, they didn't understand about these prophecies from the Old Testament until after they had all been fulfilled in Jesus. And they're like, oh, we get it now. That was from Zechariah. That was from Isaiah. That was from the Psalms. So it's like, they say these prophecies from the Old Testament, they start going back to them, and they become sources through which the followers of Jesus interpret who Jesus really was. So, like, and it says in Luke that Jesus started them on that pathway after he came back from the dead. So, like, Psalm 23 and Isaiah 53, claim clearly that Jesus would die in our place. Now, there's also the whole temple system of sacrifices that, it's clear that the New Testament followers of Jesus recognize connections between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the sacrificial lamb of the temple system and all of that. They recognize all of that.